Question 1. What factors determine the appropriate implementation of digital rights management (DRM) technologies by a broadcast station operating under Alabama broadcast regulations to ensure compliance and ethical public access? Option A. Assuming that federal copyright law entirely supersedes any state-specific broadcast regulations concerning DRM implementation in Alabama. Option B. An assessment of the DRM technology's impact on content accessibility for legitimate public uses, including educational purposes and accessibility for individuals with disabilities, in conjunction with Alabama's specific broadcast regulations. Option C. Reliance solely on the DRM technology providers' claims regarding content protection and ease of implementation without independent verification. Option D. Prioritizing the absolute prevention of any unauthorized access, even if it restricts legitimate public use or educational purposes, without considering Alabama's specific broadcast laws. Correct answer is B. An assessment of the DRM technology's impact on content accessibility for legitimate public uses, including educational purposes and accessibility for individuals with disabilities, in conjunction with Alabama's specific broadcast regulations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because broadcasters in Alabama must navigate the evolving landscape of digital rights management, DRM, while adhering to specific state regulations and ethical considerations. The core difficulty lies in balancing the protection of copyrighted content with the public's right to access information and the potential for DRM technologies to inadvertently restrict legitimate uses. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Alabama's broadcast laws and to uphold ethical broadcasting standards. The best approach involves a thorough assessment of the specific DRM technology's impact on content accessibility and potential for circumvention, considering Alabama's specific broadcast regulations. This includes evaluating whether the DRM implementation could inadvertently prevent legitimate public access to broadcast content, such as for educational purposes or by individuals with disabilities, and whether it aligns with the spirit of public service broadcasting as envisioned by Alabama law. This approach is correct because it prioritizes compliance with existing regulatory frameworks and ethical obligations, ensuring that technological implementation serves, rather than hinders, the public interest and legal requirements within Alabama. An incorrect approach would be to implement DRM solely based on the technology provider's assurances of content protection, without independent verification of its impact on accessibility and compliance with Alabama broadcast regulations. This fails to acknowledge the broadcaster's responsibility to ensure public access and could lead to violations if the DRM inadvertently restricts legitimate uses or conflicts with state broadcast mandates. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize the prevention of all unauthorized access, even at the expense of legitimate public use or educational purposes, without considering the specific provisions or intent of Alabama broadcast law. This overly restrictive stance can lead to ethical breaches and potential regulatory scrutiny if it impedes the public's right to receive information. A further incorrect approach is to assume that federal copyright law preempts all state-level broadcast regulations concerning DRM implementation. While federal law is significant, state broadcast regulations can impose additional requirements or interpretations that broadcasters must also satisfy. Ignoring state-specific nuances in favor of a purely federal perspective is a flawed strategy. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the specific DRM technology and its intended function. This should be followed by a detailed analysis of how the technology interacts with Alabama's broadcast regulations, including any provisions related to public access, accessibility for individuals with disabilities, and educational use. Ethical considerations regarding fair use and public interest should be integrated into this assessment. Finally, consultation with legal counsel specializing in Alabama broadcast law is crucial to ensure full compliance and mitigate potential risks. Question 2. Market research demonstrates that a local Alabama radio station has inadvertently failed to meet a minor technical reporting requirement for the past 2 renewal cycles, a detail that has only recently come to light during an internal audit. The station manager is concerned this oversight could jeopardize their upcoming license renewal. What is the most prudent course of action for the station manager to ensure compliance with Alabama broadcast regulation requirements? Option A. Assume the oversight is minor and will not impact the renewal process, proceeding with the renewal application without mentioning the past reporting failures. Option B. Wait until the Alabama Broadcast Authority initiates an inquiry regarding the reporting requirement, then provide an explanation and attempt to correct the issue at that time. Option C. Attempt to retroactively submit the missing reports without informing the Alabama Broadcast Authority, hoping the omission goes unnoticed during the renewal review. Option D. Immediately contact the Alabama Broadcast Authority to disclose the oversight, explain the circumstances, and inquire about the process for rectifying the reporting deficiency and ensuring license renewal. The correct answer is D. Immediately contact the Alabama Broadcast Authority to disclose the oversight, explain the circumstances, and inquire about the process for rectifying the reporting deficiency and ensuring license renewal. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a broadcast station manager in Alabama due to the critical nature of license renewal and the severe consequences of revocation. The manager must navigate the Alabama Broadcast Regulation Framework to ensure compliance and protect the station's operational viability. Failure to understand and adhere to the specific procedures for license renewal, particularly when facing potential issues, can lead to significant penalties, including the loss of the broadcast license, which is the station's primary asset. Careful judgment is required to balance operational needs with regulatory obligations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively identifying potential issues that could jeopardize license renewal and immediately engaging with the Alabama Broadcast Authority, ABA, to understand the specific requirements and potential remedies. This approach prioritizes transparency and collaboration with the regulatory body. By initiating communication early, the station manager can gain clarity on the ABA's concerns, explore options for rectification, and demonstrate a commitment to compliance. This aligns with the spirit of Alabama broadcast regulations, which encourage responsible operation and provide avenues for addressing deficiencies before they escalate to revocation proceedings. The Alabama Administrative Code, specifically provisions related to license renewal and enforcement, emphasizes the importance of timely communication and corrective action. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to delay addressing the potential issues or to assume that minor infractions will be overlooked during the renewal process. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a misunderstanding of the ABA's enforcement posture. Such inaction could be interpreted as willful disregard for regulatory requirements, increasing the likelihood of a negative outcome during license renewal. Another incorrect approach is to attempt to conceal or downplay the identified issues from the ABA. This is ethically unsound and directly violates the principles of honesty and transparency expected of broadcast licensees. Concealment can lead to more severe penalties if discovered, as it suggests an intent to deceive the regulatory authority. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to solely rely on legal counsel to manage the situation without direct engagement or understanding from the station management. While legal advice is crucial, the ultimate responsibility for compliance rests with the licensee, and a passive approach can lead to missed opportunities for proactive resolution. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should adopt a proactive and transparent approach. The first step is to thoroughly understand the specific regulatory requirements for license renewal in Alabama, consulting the relevant sections of the Alabama Administrative Code. Second, identify any potential compliance issues early and assess their severity. Third, initiate open and honest communication with the Alabama Broadcast Authority, seeking clarification and discussing potential solutions. Fourth, document all communications and actions taken. Finally, consult with legal counsel to ensure all actions are compliant with Alabama law, but remain actively involved in the resolution process. Question 3. Compliance review shows that a broadcast station in Alabama is facing scrutiny regarding its adherence to localism and diversity mandates. The station manager is tasked with developing a strategy to enhance programming that better reflects the diverse communities within its service area. Which of the following approaches would best demonstrate a commitment to fulfilling these regulatory obligations? Option A. Focus exclusively on programming that has historically achieved the highest advertising revenue, assuming this inherently serves the public interest by ensuring the station's financial stability. Option B. Conduct extensive outreach to various community groups across Alabama to solicit feedback on programming needs and preferences, and actively seek opportunities to incorporate diverse voices and perspectives into regular programming. Option C. Introduce a single, limited-run series focused on a specific minority group's cultural heritage, without altering the station's core programming schedule. Option D. Analyze existing listener data and demographic trends to identify the most popular programming genres and tailor content to appeal to the largest segments of the current audience. The correct answer is B. Conduct extensive outreach to various community groups across Alabama to solicit feedback on programming needs and preferences, and actively seek opportunities to incorporate diverse voices and perspectives into regular programming. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a broadcast station manager in Alabama because it requires balancing the station's commercial interests with its public service obligations, specifically concerning localism and diversity. The Alabama Broadcast Regulation exam emphasizes that stations are licensed to serve the public interest, which includes reflecting the diverse communities within their service area. A manager must navigate the complexities of programming decisions to ensure compliance with these mandates, without alienating the existing listener base or incurring financial losses. This requires a nuanced understanding of regulatory expectations and community needs, making careful judgment essential. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves proactively engaging with diverse community groups to understand their programming needs and preferences. This includes conducting outreach, soliciting feedback, and actively seeking diverse voices and perspectives for on-air content. This approach directly addresses the core principles of localism and diversity by ensuring that the station's programming reflects the actual composition and interests of the Alabama community it serves. Alabama broadcast regulations, like those in many jurisdictions, place a strong emphasis on a licensee's commitment to serving the public interest, which is demonstrated through responsive and inclusive programming. By actively seeking input and incorporating it into programming decisions, the station manager fulfills their regulatory duty to foster diversity and local relevance. Incorrect approaches analysis. Relying solely on existing listener data and demographic trends to inform programming decisions is insufficient because it may perpetuate existing biases and fail to capture the needs of underrepresented groups. This approach risks overlooking emerging communities or segments of the population whose voices are not yet reflected in current listenership data, thereby failing to promote diversity. Implementing a token diversity initiative, such as a single weekly program dedicated to a minority group, without genuine integration into the station's overall programming strategy, is also problematic. This approach can be perceived as superficial and does not demonstrate a sustained commitment to diversity or localism. It fails to embed diverse perspectives across the station's broadcast schedule, thus not truly serving the broad spectrum of the Alabama community. Prioritizing programming that has historically generated the highest ratings, even if it lacks local relevance or diversity, directly contravenes the spirit and letter of broadcast regulations concerning public service. While commercial viability is important, it cannot supersede the fundamental obligation to serve the public interest, which includes promoting local content and reflecting community diversity. This approach neglects the station's responsibility to contribute positively to the social and cultural fabric of Alabama. Professional reasoning. Professionals in broadcast management should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of their regulatory obligations, particularly regarding localism and diversity. This involves continuous engagement with the community to identify evolving needs and perspectives. Programming decisions should then be evaluated not only for their commercial potential, but also for their alignment with public service mandates. A proactive, inclusive, and responsive approach to programming, informed by genuine community dialogue, is the most effective way to ensure compliance and fulfill the station's role as a responsible public broadcaster in Alabama. Question 4. Strategic planning requires a broadcast station owner in Alabama to consider the implications of a significant minority shareholder acquiring additional stock, potentially altering the station's management and operational control. Which of the following actions best ensures compliance with Alabama broadcast licensing and ownership regulations? Option A. Rely solely on general corporate legal advice to structure the stock transaction, without specific inquiry into broadcast regulatory requirements. Option B. Proceed with the stock acquisition, assuming that as long as no single individual obtains a majority stake, regulatory notification is not required. Option C. Complete the stock acquisition and then inform the Alabama Public Service Commission and the Federal Communications Commission of the change, if it is deemed significant after the fact. Option D. Proactively consult with the Alabama Public Service Commission and the Federal Communications Commission to determine if the stock acquisition constitutes a reportable transfer of control and seek necessary approvals. The correct answer is D. Proactively consult with the Alabama Public Service Commission and the Federal Communications Commission to determine if the stock acquisition constitutes a reportable transfer of control and seek necessary approvals. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complex interplay between broadcast licensing requirements and ownership regulations in Alabama, specifically concerning the transfer of control of a broadcast station. A licensee must ensure that any transaction does not violate the Federal Communications Commission's (FCC) rules, which are enforced in Alabama, regarding ownership concentration, attribution, and the public interest. Careful judgment is required to avoid inadvertently triggering a violation that could jeopardize the station's license. The best professional approach involves proactively seeking guidance from the Alabama Public Service Commission (APSC) and the FCC regarding the proposed ownership change. This approach is correct because it demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and the public interest. By engaging with regulatory bodies early, the licensee can ensure that the transaction structure aligns with all applicable Alabama broadcast regulations and FCC rules, including those pertaining to the transfer of control. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of post-transaction violations and ensures the continued operation of the station in the public interest, as mandated by Alabama broadcast law. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a simple change in stock ownership, even if it doesn't result in a majority stake for a single individual, automatically bypasses the need for regulatory review. This is incorrect because Alabama broadcast regulations, mirroring FCC rules, consider transfer of control broadly. Any transaction that results in a change in the ability to direct the management and operation of a broadcast station, regardless of the percentage of stock changing hands, can be deemed a transfer of control requiring FCC approval. Failing to seek this approval is a direct violation of broadcast licensing requirements. Another incorrect approach is to proceed with the transaction based solely on the advice of corporate legal counsel without consulting broadcast regulatory experts or the relevant state and federal agencies. While corporate counsel is essential, they may not have specialized knowledge of the intricate broadcast licensing and ownership rules specific to Alabama. This oversight can lead to a transaction that is legally sound from a corporate perspective, but violates broadcast regulations, potentially leading to penalties or license revocation. Finally, an incorrect approach is to delay or ignore the notification requirements to the APSC and FCC, hoping the transaction will go unnoticed. This is a grave ethical and regulatory failure. Transparency and timely reporting are fundamental tenets of broadcast regulation. Attempting to circumvent these requirements demonstrates a disregard for the law and the public trust placed in broadcast licensees, invariably leading to severe consequences. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Identifying all potential regulatory touchpoints for any proposed transaction. 2. Consulting with legal counsel specializing in broadcast law and engaging directly with relevant state and federal regulatory bodies for clarification and approval. 3. Documenting all communications and decisions made throughout the process. 4. Prioritizing the public interest and the integrity of the broadcast license above all other considerations. Question 5. Market research demonstrates that a local Alabama radio station is experiencing declining listenership among younger demographics. The station manager is considering a programming shift. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the Alabama Broadcast Commission's definition of public interest in this situation? Option A. Focus exclusively on programming that generates the highest advertising revenue, as financial stability is paramount to the station's long-term ability to serve the public. Option B. Conduct extensive community outreach to identify specific programming interests of younger Alabamians, including educational content, local cultural events, and discussions on issues relevant to their lives, and then develop programming to address these identified needs. Option C. Immediately pivot to a format heavily featuring trending national music and celebrity gossip, as this is demonstrably popular with younger audiences nationwide. Option D. Reduce the amount of local news and public affairs programming to make more time for syndicated talk shows that have broad national appeal, assuming this will attract a wider audience. The correct answer is B. Conduct extensive community outreach to identify specific programming interests of younger Alabamians, including educational content, local cultural events, and discussions on issues relevant to their lives, and then develop programming to address these identified needs. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because the Alabama Broadcast Commission's definition of public interest is not a static, easily quantifiable metric. It requires broadcasters to exercise significant judgment in balancing commercial imperatives with their public service obligations. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting and applying a broad, qualitative standard to concrete programming decisions. Careful judgment is required to ensure that programming decisions genuinely serve the diverse needs and interests of the Alabama community, rather than solely maximizing profit or catering to a narrow segment of the audience. The best professional practice involves a proactive and comprehensive assessment of community needs and interests, documented and integrated into programming strategy. This approach recognizes that serving the public interest is an ongoing responsibility that requires understanding the local context. By actively seeking input from diverse community groups, analyzing demographic data, and considering the unique cultural and social landscape of Alabama, a broadcaster can develop programming that demonstrably addresses the public's needs and concerns. This aligns with the spirit of Alabama broadcast regulation, which emphasizes the importance of localism and responsiveness to the community. An approach that prioritizes solely the most popular or commercially viable programming, without regard for broader community needs, fails to meet the public interest standard. This is because it prioritizes profit over public service, potentially neglecting the informational, educational, and cultural needs of significant portions of the Alabama population. Such a narrow focus can lead to a lack of diverse viewpoints and underrepresentation of minority interests, which are crucial components of serving the public interest. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to rely on generic, national programming trends without considering their specific relevance or impact on the Alabama audience. While national trends may offer insights, they do not inherently satisfy the local public interest requirements mandated by Alabama broadcast regulations. A broadcaster must demonstrate how its programming serves the specific needs and interests of its local Alabama listeners and viewers. Finally, an approach that interprets public interest as simply avoiding overt violations of broadcast law without actively seeking to serve the community is insufficient. The public interest standard goes beyond mere compliance. It requires a positive commitment to contributing to the well-being and enrichment of the community through thoughtful and responsible programming. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the regulatory definition of public interest within Alabama. This involves actively engaging with the community to identify needs and interests, critically evaluating programming proposals against these identified needs, and maintaining transparent documentation of these efforts. Regular review and adaptation of programming strategies based on community feedback and evolving needs are essential for fulfilling the public interest obligation. Question 6. The monitoring system demonstrates an incoming emergency alert system, EASE, transmission originating from a local county emergency management agency in Alabama, but your station's internal diagnostic tools indicate a potential, though not definitive, technical anomaly with your receiving equipment. Considering the critical nature of EAS alerts and Alabama's specific regulatory framework for emergency broadcasting, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the broadcast station? Option A. Attempt to immediately verify the authenticity of the alert through direct communication with the originating agency or by monitoring other reliable EAS stations in the vicinity before proceeding with a broadcast. Option B. Broadcast the alert immediately without further verification, prioritizing the potential for a genuine emergency over the suspected technical anomaly. Option C. Ignore the alert and assume it is a false alarm or a test due to the detected technical anomaly, and continue with regular programming. Option D. Broadcast the alert but include a disclaimer stating that the station is experiencing technical difficulties and the alert's authenticity is unconfirmed. The correct answer is A. Attempt to immediately verify the authenticity of the alert through direct communication with the originating agency or by monitoring other reliable EAS stations in the vicinity before proceeding with a broadcast. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires immediate decision-making under pressure, balancing the critical need for public safety information with the potential for technical malfunction and the integrity of the emergency alert system. Ease in Alabama. Broadcasters have a legal and ethical obligation to ensure the EAS functions correctly and that alerts are disseminated accurately and without undue delay. Misinterpreting or mishandling an EAS activation can have severe consequences, including public confusion, loss of trust, and potential failure to warn citizens during genuine emergencies. The best professional approach involves a systematic verification process that prioritizes the integrity of the alert and public safety. This means immediately attempting to verify the authenticity of the alert through multiple independent channels, such as contacting the originating authority directly or monitoring other reliable EAS stations in the region. If verification confirms a genuine emergency, the station must proceed with the required broadcast protocols as mandated by Alabama's EAS plan and FCC regulations. This approach ensures compliance with the spirit and letter of EAS regulations, which are designed to protect the public. An incorrect approach involves immediately broadcasting the alert without any attempt at verification. This is a significant regulatory failure because it bypasses the established protocols designed to prevent false alarms and maintain the credibility of the EAS. While the intent might be to err on the side of caution, broadcasting unverified alerts can lead to public panic, desensitization to future alerts, and potential liability for the station. It directly contravenes the requirement for stations to ensure the accuracy and legitimacy of the information disseminated through the EAS. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the alert entirely due to a perceived technical glitch or a belief that it might be a test. This is a critical failure to uphold the station's responsibility to the public safety infrastructure. Even if a technical issue is suspected, the initial response should be to investigate and attempt verification, not to dismiss the alert outright. This inaction could result in a failure to disseminate vital emergency information, which is a direct violation of EAS obligations and FCC rules. A further incorrect approach is to broadcast the alert but include personal commentary or speculation about its authenticity. While transparency is important, the EAS is a standardized system for disseminating official emergency information. Adding unverified commentary undermines the authority and clarity of the official alert and can introduce confusion. The station's role is to relay the official message, not to interpret or question it on air during the initial broadcast phase, which could also be seen as a deviation from prescribed EAS procedures. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that emphasizes a tiered approach to EAS alerts. 1. Immediate recognition of an incoming alert. 2. Prioritization of verification through established protocols and multiple sources. 3. If verified, prompt and accurate dissemination according to Alabama's EAS plan and FCC rules. 4. If unverified or suspect, further investigation and consultation with authorities before any broadcast. This structured process ensures compliance, protects public safety, and maintains the integrity of the EAS. Question 7. Operational review demonstrates that while TV in Mobile, Alabama, is facing significant financial pressures, the station management is considering reducing its commitment to local public service programming to cut costs. What is the most appropriate course of action for WALA TV to take in this situation, considering Alabama broadcast regulations? Option A. Proactively engage with the Alabama Public Service Commission to discuss the financial challenges and explore potential strategies for fulfilling public service obligations. Option B. Cease all non-essential public service programming and await a directive from the Alabama Public Service Commission regarding future requirements. Option C. Eliminate all public service programming to maximize revenue, believing that financial viability is the primary responsibility of the station. Option D. Immediately reduce public service programming to align with the new budget, assuming the Alabama Public Service Commission will not object to minor adjustments. The correct answer is A. Proactively engage with the Alabama Public Service Commission to discuss the financial challenges and explore potential strategies for fulfilling public service obligations. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the need to balance the public interest in receiving accurate and informative broadcast content with the station's operational and financial considerations. The Alabama broadcast landscape is governed by specific regulations designed to ensure public service, and any decision must align with these principles. The best approach involves proactively engaging with the Alabama Public Service Commission, PSC, to understand their expectations regarding public service programming and to explore potential avenues for fulfilling these obligations within the station's current financial constraints. This demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and a willingness to collaborate with the governing body. The justification for this approach lies in Alabama's broadcast regulations, which emphasize the licensee's responsibility to serve the public interest. By seeking guidance and proposing solutions, the station acts in accordance with the spirit and letter of these regulations, fostering a positive relationship with the PSC and ensuring continued licensure. An approach that involves simply reducing public service programming without prior consultation with the PSC is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the regulatory framework, which mandates that licensees operate in the public interest. Such an action could be interpreted as a breach of the station's license agreement and could lead to enforcement actions by the PSC. Another unacceptable approach is to assume that the PSC will not notice or object to the reduction in public service programming. This is a risky and unprofessional assumption that ignores the oversight responsibilities of the PSC. Broadcasting licenses are granted with the understanding that the licensee will uphold specific public service commitments, and a passive approach to fulfilling these obligations is a direct violation of that understanding. Finally, an approach that prioritizes solely profit maximization by eliminating all public service programming, regardless of regulatory requirements, is fundamentally flawed. Alabama broadcast law, like that in most jurisdictions, requires licensees to provide a certain level of public service. Ignoring this requirement for financial gain is a clear violation of the license terms and ethical broadcasting standards. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding their regulatory obligations thoroughly. They should then engage in open and honest communication with the relevant regulatory bodies, seeking clarification and proposing solutions that are both compliant and operationally feasible. A proactive, collaborative, and transparent approach is key to navigating these challenges effectively and ethically. Question 8. The assessment process reveals that a local Alabama radio station is considering a new advertising campaign for a statewide political candidate. The campaign involves endorsements and claims about the candidate's policy positions. The station manager is unsure whether to prioritize Federal Communications Commission, FCC, guidelines or Alabama state election law regarding the disclosure of campaign funding and the substantiation of claims made in political advertisements. Which approach best navigates this regulatory landscape? Option A. Prioritize Federal Communications Commission, FCC, guidelines for all aspects of political advertising, as broadcasting is inherently interstate commerce, and then consult Alabama state election law only for specific disclosure requirements unique to state-level campaigns that are not addressed by federal rules. Option B. Assume that all advertising within Alabama is exclusively governed by Alabama state election law, as the station operates within the state's borders. Option C. Apply only Federal Communications Commission, FCC, guidelines, as federal regulations always supersede state laws in broadcasting matters. Option D. Focus solely on Alabama state election law for all aspects of the political advertising campaign, as the campaign is for a state-level candidate and therefore a purely state matter. The correct answer is A. Prioritize Federal Communications Commission, FCC, guidelines for all aspects of political advertising, as broadcasting is inherently interstate commerce, and then consult Alabama state election law only for specific disclosure requirements unique to state-level campaigns that are not addressed by federal rules. Explanation: the assessment process reveals a common challenge in broadcasting, navigating the overlapping yet distinct regulatory spheres of federal and state authority in Alabama. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of which entity holds primary jurisdiction over specific broadcasting activities, demanding careful judgment to avoid legal and regulatory noncompliance. Misinterpreting these boundaries can lead to significant penalties, reputational damage, and operational disruptions. The best professional approach involves recognizing that the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, holds broad authority over interstate broadcasting, including licensing, technical standards, and content regulation related to obscenity, indecency, and political advertising. State-level regulations in Alabama, however, typically focus on areas not preempted by federal law, such as specific state advertising disclosure requirements for political candidates, local zoning for broadcast towers, or state-level consumer protection laws that might indirectly affect broadcast advertising practices. Therefore, a broadcaster must first identify the core nature of the regulatory concern. If it pertains to signal transmission, licensing, or content that falls under FCC purview, federal law is paramount. If the concern relates to specific state-level consumer protection, advertising disclosures unique to Alabama elections, or local operational matters, then Alabama law becomes the primary consideration. This layered approach ensures compliance with both federal mandates and state-specific requirements, respecting the division of powers. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any broadcasting activity within Alabama is solely subject to state regulation. This fails to acknowledge the FCC's extensive authority over interstate commerce, which broadcasting inherently is. Such an assumption would lead to overlooking federal requirements concerning broadcast licenses, technical operations, and content standards, potentially resulting in FCC enforcement actions. Another incorrect approach is to exclusively apply federal regulations to all broadcasting matters within Alabama, disregarding any specific state laws. Federal law is often dominant. Alabama may have enacted regulations in areas where federal law is silent or has been delegated. For instance, Alabama might have specific rules regarding the disclosure of funding for political advertisements that are more stringent or detailed than federal requirements, or it might have specific consumer protection laws related to broadcast advertising that are enforced by state agencies. Ignoring these state-specific rules would be a regulatory failure. A final incorrect approach involves applying federal regulations to matters that are clearly within the exclusive jurisdiction of Alabama, such as local zoning ordinances for broadcast tower placement or specific state-level consumer protection laws that do not conflict with federal regulations. While the FCC regulates tower construction from a technical and safety perspective, local zoning is often a state or municipal matter. Similarly, while the FCC has broad content rules, state consumer protection laws can address deceptive advertising practices that might not rise to the level of federal concern. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the specific broadcasting activity or issue. Then, they must determine whether the activity falls under the FCC's enumerated powers, e.g., licensing, technical standards, interstate communication, or if it pertains to areas where states retain authority, e.g., local zoning, specific consumer protection not preempted by federal law, state election advertising disclosures. Consulting with legal counsel specializing in broadcast law in Alabama is crucial to accurately interpret the interplay between federal and state regulations for any given situation. Question 9. The performance metrics show a significant decline in listenership for a local AM radio station in Alabama, impacting its advertising revenue. The station manager is considering a strategic shift to better serve the community and improve financial viability. Which of the following actions best addresses this situation while adhering to Alabama broadcast regulations? Option A. Begin broadcasting music formats and content typically associated with FM stations without seeking any new licensing. Option B. Cease all broadcasting operations immediately to cut costs, assuming the license will simply expire. Option C. Investigate the feasibility of obtaining an FM broadcast license to potentially reach a wider audience with improved sound quality, while continuing to operate under the current AM license until any new license is secured and operational. Option D. Immediately increase the power output of the existing AM transmitter to broadcast over a wider geographic area and attract more listeners. The correct answer is C. Investigate the feasibility of obtaining an FM broadcast license to potentially reach a wider audience with improved sound quality, while continuing to operate under the current AM license until any new license is secured and operational. Explanation: the performance metrics show a significant decline in listenership for a local AM radio station in Alabama, impacting its advertising revenue. The station manager is considering a strategic shift to better serve the community and improve financial viability. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the station's existing broadcast license obligations with the need for adaptation in a changing media landscape. A careful judgment is needed to ensure any proposed changes comply with Alabama broadcast regulations, while also being commercially sound and ethically responsible. The best approach involves a thorough review of the station's current AM broadcast license, understanding its specific limitations and opportunities within Alabama law, and then exploring the feasibility of obtaining an FM broadcast license. This is the correct approach because Alabama law, like federal regulations overseen by the FCC, distinguishes between AM and FM licenses, each with different technical characteristics, spectrum allocation, and potential for audience reach. Pursuing an FM license, if technically and financially feasible, allows the station to potentially reach a wider audience with better sound quality, which is often preferred by advertisers and listeners, thereby addressing the performance metric decline. This aligns with the regulatory goal of providing diverse and accessible broadcasting services. An incorrect approach would be to simply increase the power output of the existing AM transmitter without proper authorization. This is a regulatory failure because altering broadcast parameters beyond those specified in the license requires explicit approval from the relevant regulatory bodies, could lead to interference with other licensed stations, violating Alabama broadcast regulations, and potentially resulting in fines or license revocation. Another incorrect approach would be to begin broadcasting content typically associated with an FM license, such as music formats that are less common on AM, without securing the appropriate FM license. This is a violation of the terms of the AM license and a circumvention of the licensing process. Alabama broadcast regulations are designed to ensure that specific frequencies and broadcast types are allocated through a structured process to prevent chaos and ensure fair access to the airwaves. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to cease broadcasting altogether without formally surrendering the AM license. This is a failure to adhere to regulatory procedures. Licenses are granted with specific responsibilities, and abandoning broadcast operations without proper notification and surrender can lead to penalties and complications for future licensing attempts. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the full scope of their current license obligations under Alabama broadcast law. They should then research the regulatory pathways and requirements for obtaining different types of licenses, such as FM, and assess the technical and financial feasibility. Consulting with legal counsel specializing in broadcast law in Alabama is crucial to ensure all actions are compliant. This systematic process, prioritizing regulatory adherence and strategic planning, allows for informed decision-making that benefits both the station and the public interest. Question 10. The audit findings indicate that a radio station in Birmingham, Alabama, has sold advertising slots for alcoholic beverages. The station broadcasts for 18 hours per day. Alabama law stipulates that no more than 10 minutes of advertising time per hour of broadcast may be dedicated to alcoholic beverages. If the station sold 200 minutes of alcohol advertising in a single broadcast day, what is the total amount of advertising time that exceeded the legal limit? Option A, 10 minutes. Option B, 0 minutes. Option C, 30 minutes. Option D, 20 minutes. The correct answer is D, 20 minutes. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a broadcaster to balance the desire for advertising revenue with strict adherence to Alabama's regulations concerning the promotion of alcoholic beverages. The challenge lies in accurately calculating the permissible advertising time based on specific legal limitations, ensuring compliance without misinterpreting the rules, which could lead to significant penalties. The best approach involves a precise calculation of the total advertising time permitted for alcoholic beverages during the specified broadcast day. This requires understanding Alabama's specific regulations, which often dictate a percentage of total broadcast time or a maximum number of minutes per hour for such advertisements. For example, if Alabama law permits a maximum of 10 minutes of alcohol advertising per hour, and the station broadcasts for 18 hours, the total permissible advertising time would be backslash 10 backslash text minutes slash hour backslash times 18 backslash text hours equals 180 backslash text minutes backslash. The station must then ensure that the total advertising time sold for alcohol does not exceed this calculated limit. This meticulous, data-driven approach ensures direct compliance with Alabama broadcast law, minimizing legal risk and maintaining the station's license. An incorrect approach would be to simply allocate advertising slots based on general advertising demand, without a specific calculation tied to the legal limits for alcohol. This fails to account for the specialized restrictions placed on alcohol advertising in Alabama, potentially leading to oversaturation and violation of regulations. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that any advertising time not explicitly prohibited is permissible. Alabama law is specific about what is allowed, and failing to adhere to these positive restrictions, rather than just avoiding prohibitions, is a regulatory failure. Finally, relying on industry best practices or general advertising guidelines from other states or national bodies, without verifying them against Alabama's specific statutes, is also a flawed strategy, as it ignores the unique legal landscape of the state. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying all applicable state and local regulations pertaining to the specific advertising category, in this case, alcohol in Alabama. 2. Performing precise calculations based on these regulations to determine permissible limits. 3. Implementing internal controls and verification processes to ensure adherence to these calculated limits. 4. Regularly reviewing and updating knowledge of these regulations as they may change. Question 11. Cost-benefit analysis shows that acquiring a cluster of radio stations in the Birmingham, Alabama metropolitan area could significantly increase market share and revenue. However, the potential buyer already owns several other radio stations within the same market. What is the most prudent approach to ensure compliance with Alabama broadcast ownership regulations? Option A. Conduct a detailed analysis of the Federal Communications Commission's, FCC, local radio ownership rules to determine if the proposed acquisition would exceed the permissible number of stations within the Birmingham market, and consult with legal counsel specializing in media law to interpret these rules in the context of the specific transaction. Option B. Prioritize the financial benefits of the acquisition and proceed, believing that market forces will naturally prevent any undue concentration of media ownership. Option C. Proceed with the acquisition, assuming that as long as no specific Alabama state law explicitly prohibits the ownership of multiple radio stations in the same market, the transaction is permissible. Option D. Rely on the advice of experienced broadcast industry colleagues who have successfully acquired multiple stations in similar markets without encountering regulatory issues. Correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed analysis of the Federal Communications Commission's, FCC, local radio ownership rules to determine if the proposed acquisition would exceed the permissible number of stations within the Birmingham market, and consult with legal counsel specializing in media law to interpret these rules in the context of the specific transaction. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a broadcaster in Alabama to navigate the complex and often nuanced ownership rules established by the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, and interpreted by state-level broadcast authorities. The core challenge lies in determining whether a proposed acquisition would result in undue concentration of media ownership, potentially impacting localism and diverse viewpoints, while also ensuring compliance with specific Alabama broadcast regulations. Careful judgment is required to balance business objectives with regulatory obligations and the public interest. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough review of the FCC's media ownership rules, including the local radio ownership rule, the local television ownership rule, and the national television ownership rule, as they apply to the Alabama market. This approach necessitates a detailed analysis of the existing station ownership landscape within the relevant Alabama geographic areas to identify any potential violations. Specifically, It requires assessing whether the acquisition would lead to a broadcaster owning too many stations in a single market or exceeding national ownership limits. This is correct because it directly addresses the FCC's mandate to prevent media monopolies and promote a diversity of voices, which is a fundamental principle of broadcast regulation in the United States, including Alabama. Adherence to these specific FCC rules is paramount for legal operation. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that as long as the acquisition does not violate any explicit Alabama state statutes regarding broadcast ownership, it is permissible. This is incorrect because broadcast ownership is primarily governed by federal FCC regulations, which preempt state law in this area. Alabama broadcasters must comply with both federal and any applicable state regulations, but the FCC's rules are the overarching framework. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the financial viability of the acquisition without considering its impact on media diversity. While financial health is important, it does not excuse regulatory noncompliance. The FCC's ownership rules are designed to protect the public interest, not just the financial interests of broadcasters. Finally, an approach that relies on informal assurances from industry peers or outdated interpretations of ownership rules is also professionally unacceptable. Broadcast regulations are subject to change and require diligent, up-to-date research and legal counsel to ensure compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic approach that begins with identifying all applicable federal and state regulations. This involves consulting official FCC documents, relevant Alabama broadcast statutes, and seeking advice from legal counsel specializing in media law. A comprehensive ownership analysis should be conducted, mapping existing station holdings against regulatory limits. This proactive due diligence ensures that potential compliance issues are identified and addressed before an acquisition is finalized, thereby mitigating legal and financial risks and upholding the principles of responsible broadcasting. Question 12. The risk matrix shows a potential acquisition opportunity for media conglomerate currently owning a daily newspaper in Montgomery, Alabama, to acquire a local radio station based in Auburn, Alabama. Considering the specific broadcast cross-ownership regulations in Alabama, what is the most prudent course of action to assess the regulatory implications of this proposed transaction? Option A. Obtain a general legal opinion on media ownership from a firm that handles corporate mergers, without specifically inquiring about Alabama's unique broadcast cross-ownership statutes. Option B. Proceed with the acquisition, assuming no conflict exists because the newspaper is in Montgomery and the radio station is in Auburn, and Alabama's regulations are likely similar to national standards. Option C. Conduct a detailed analysis of Alabama's broadcast cross-ownership rules to determine if the newspaper in Montgomery and the radio station in Auburn serve the same community, and if any common ownership would violate specific prohibitions. Option D. Focus on the financial viability of the radio station and the potential for revenue synergy, deferring any detailed regulatory review until after the acquisition is finalized. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed analysis of Alabama's broadcast cross-ownership rules to determine if the newspaper in Montgomery and the radio station in Auburn serve the same community, and if any common ownership would violate specific prohibitions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between business expansion goals and the strict limitations imposed by Alabama's broadcast cross-ownership regulations. The need to assess the impact of potential acquisitions requires a nuanced understanding of these rules to avoid significant legal and financial repercussions. Careful judgment is paramount to ensure compliance while pursuing strategic growth. The best approach involves a thorough and proactive assessment of the proposed acquisition's compatibility with Alabama's specific cross-ownership rules, particularly concerning the prohibition of common ownership of a daily newspaper and a broadcast station serving the same community. This means meticulously identifying any existing media holdings of the acquiring entity and the target entity within the relevant Alabama market. The justification for this approach lies in its direct adherence to the spirit and letter of the law, which aims to prevent undue concentration of media influence. By conducting this due diligence upfront, the acquiring entity can identify potential conflicts early, allowing for informed decisions about divestiture, restructuring, or abandoning the acquisition altogether, thereby minimizing regulatory risk and ensuring long-term compliance. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the acquisition based on a general understanding of media ownership rules, without a specific, detailed analysis of Alabama's broadcast cross-ownership regulations. This could lead to an unintentional violation, as the specific prohibitions in Alabama might be more stringent or have unique interpretations compared to national or other state-level regulations. Regulatory failure here is the lack of specific due diligence tailored to the governing jurisdiction. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because the target entity is a radio station and the acquiring entity owns a newspaper in a different Alabama county, there is no conflict. This overlooks the critical element of serving the same community, which is a key determinant in cross-ownership rules. Even if the entities are in different counties, if their broadcast signal or newspaper circulation significantly overlaps or influences the same community, a violation could still occur. The ethical and regulatory failure is a misinterpretation of the scope and intent of the same community provision. A further incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the advice of legal counsel specializing in general corporate law, without ensuring they have specific expertise in Alabama broadcast media regulations. While general legal advice is valuable, it may not capture the intricate details and specific enforcement priorities of the Alabama Public Service Commission or relevant broadcast authorities regarding cross-ownership. The professional decision-making process should involve seeking specialized counsel or ensuring that general counsel consults with experts in the specific regulatory domain of Alabama broadcast law. Professionals should always prioritize a proactive, jurisdiction-specific compliance strategy, conducting thorough due diligence before committing to any acquisition that could trigger cross-ownership concerns. Question 13. Stakeholder feedback indicates that a popular Alabama radio station's coverage of a proposed local zoning change has consistently featured proponents of the change, while offering only brief, dismissive mentions of opposing viewpoints. Considering the historical implications of the fairness doctrine and the ongoing responsibility of broadcasters to serve the public interest in Alabama, which of the following represents the most appropriate and professionally responsible course of action for the station's management? Option A. Continue current programming, as the station is not legally obligated under current Alabama state law to provide equal airtime for all viewpoints on local zoning issues. Option B. Issue a public statement defending the station's current coverage, asserting that the station has the editorial discretion to determine which viewpoints are most relevant to the audience. Option C. Immediately schedule additional programming segments dedicated to presenting the arguments of those opposing the zoning change in a fair and substantive manner, and review internal editorial guidelines to ensure future coverage of controversial public issues maintains balance. Option D. Wait for a formal complaint to be filed by an aggrieved party before considering any adjustments to the station's programming regarding the zoning change debate. The correct answer is C. Immediately schedule additional programming segments dedicated to presenting the arguments of those opposing the zoning change in a fair and substantive manner, and review internal editorial guidelines to ensure future coverage of controversial public issues maintains balance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a broadcaster to balance the public interest in receiving diverse viewpoints with the practical realities of limited airtime and the potential for controversy. The Alabama Broadcast Regulation exam, particularly concerning the fairness doctrine's implications, demands careful judgment to ensure compliance with both the spirit and letter of the law, as well as ethical broadcasting standards. The best professional practice involves proactively identifying and addressing potential fairness issues before they escalate. This approach recognizes that the fairness doctrine, while not explicitly codified in Alabama state law in the same way as federal regulations once were, still informs the ethical obligations of broadcasters to serve the public interest. A broadcaster operating in Alabama has a responsibility to consider how their programming impacts the community's access to a wide range of significant public issues. By establishing clear internal guidelines for identifying controversial public issues and ensuring that opposing viewpoints are presented, the broadcaster demonstrates a commitment to responsible journalism and community service. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of complaints and regulatory scrutiny, fostering trust with the audience and regulatory bodies. An incorrect approach would be to ignore or dismiss stakeholder concerns about a lack of balanced coverage. This demonstrates a disregard for the public interest and the fundamental principles of fair broadcasting. Such an approach fails to acknowledge the broadcaster's role in informing the public and can lead to accusations of bias, potentially resulting in formal complaints to the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, if federal broadcast licenses are involved, or to industry self-regulatory bodies if applicable. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to wait for a formal complaint before considering the issue of fairness. This reactive stance suggests a lack of commitment to proactive ethical broadcasting and public service. It implies that the broadcaster is only willing to address fairness concerns when compelled to do so, rather than striving for balanced programming as a matter of course. This can damage the station's reputation and create an adversarial relationship with the community it serves. Finally, a flawed approach involves selectively presenting information or framing discussions in a way that subtly favors one viewpoint over others, even if opposing views are technically mentioned. This undermines the intent of fairness by creating an illusion of balance without genuine substantive presentation of differing perspectives. It is a disingenuous attempt to meet a technical requirement, while failing to uphold the ethical obligation to provide a truly fair and informative broadcast. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes proactive engagement with community concerns and a thorough understanding of the public interest obligations inherent in broadcasting. This involves establishing clear editorial policies, regularly reviewing programming for balance on significant public issues, and fostering an open dialogue with stakeholders. When concerns arise, the immediate step should be a thorough internal review of the programming in question, consulting relevant guidelines, and seeking to understand the perspective of those raising the concern before deciding on a course of action to ensure fairness. Question 14. Regulatory review indicates that a popular radio station in Birmingham, Alabama, is considering airing a live interview segment that includes candid discussions about sexual health and relationships, featuring guests known for their frank and sometimes provocative language. The station's management is aware of the FCC's indecency regulations, but is unsure if the planned content will cross the line into patently offensive material as defined by contemporary community standards in Alabama. What is the most prudent and legally compliant course of action for the station to take? Option A. Proceed with airing the interview as planned, relying on the on-air personality's judgment to self-censor if the discussion becomes too explicit. Assuming that past similar content has not resulted in complaints. Option B. Consult with an experienced broadcast attorney licensed in Alabama to review the specific content and provide guidance on its compliance with FCC indecency regulations before airing. Option C. Limit the discussion to general topics of relationships and avoid any explicit language or descriptions, effectively sanitizing the content to the point where it loses its intended impact and educational value. Option D. Broadcast the interview without prior review, but instruct the on-air talent to issue a general disclaimer at the beginning of the segment stating that the content may be sensitive and is intended for mature audiences. The correct answer is B. Consult with an experienced broadcast attorney licensed in Alabama to review the specific content and provide guidance on its compliance with FCC indecency regulations before airing. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the subjective nature of indecency and obscenity, and the potential for significant legal and reputational consequences for a broadcast station in Alabama. Broadcasters must navigate the line between constitutionally protected speech and content that violates federal law, specifically Section 1464 of Title 18 of the U.S. Code, as enforced by the Federal Communications Commission, FCC. The FCC's indecency rules apply to obscene, indecent, or profane broadcasts over the public airwaves. Obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment and is illegal. Indecency is defined as language or material that, in context, depicts or describes, in terms of sexual or excretory organs or activities, in a patently offensive manner as measured by contemporary community standards for the broadcast medium. Profanity is defined as grossly offensive language that is so devoid of artistic, political, or social value as to be beyond the protection of the First Amendment. The FCC's enforcement is particularly sensitive during hours when children are likely to be in the audience, 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. The best professional approach involves a proactive and informed decision-making process that prioritizes adherence to FCC regulations and established legal precedent. This includes consulting with legal counsel specializing in broadcast law, to interpret the nuances of indecency standards and to review potentially problematic content before broadcast. This approach ensures that the station operates within the bounds of the law, minimizes the risk of FCC sanctions, fines, license revocation, and protects its reputation within the Alabama community. Legal counsel can provide expert guidance on what constitutes patently offensive and contemporary community standards in the context of Alabama, considering relevant FCC decisions and court rulings. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the personal judgment of on-air personalities or station management, without seeking expert legal advice. While personalities may have a general understanding of what is acceptable, their subjective interpretation may not align with the FCC's legal definitions and enforcement priorities. This can lead to unintentional violations, as what one person considers acceptable might be deemed patently offensive by the FCC based on community standards. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to assume that content previously aired without complaint is automatically permissible for future broadcasts. Broadcast regulations and their interpretation can evolve, and community standards can shift. Furthermore, a single complaint, if substantiated by the FCC, can trigger an investigation and potential penalties, regardless of past leniency. Relying on past non-enforcement is a risky strategy that does not demonstrate due diligence. Finally, a flawed approach is to dismiss complaints about content without thorough investigation or consultation. Every complaint, especially those related to indecency or obscenity, should be taken seriously and reviewed against FCC guidelines. Ignoring complaints or assuming they are frivolous can lead to a failure to identify and rectify potential violations, increasing the station's vulnerability to FCC action. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multi-step approach. 1. Establish clear internal guidelines for content that align with FCC regulations. 2. Provide regular training for all staff, especially on-air talent, regarding indecency and obscenity standards. 3. Implement a pre-broadcast review process for any content that might be borderline. 4. Maintain open communication channels with legal counsel for ongoing advice and review. 5. Take all viewer and listener complaints seriously and investigate them thoroughly. Question 15. Performance analysis shows that WZIS TV in Alabama is airing a new children's program featuring animated characters discussing complex financial topics like compound interest and stock market fluctuations. The program airs during a time slot that also includes programming for very young children, and the station has not provided any advisories regarding the content's suitability for different age groups within the target demographic. Which of the following approaches best aligns with Alabama broadcast regulations and professional ethical standards for children's programming? Option A. Focus on the program's educational value and assume that the animated characters will make the complex financial concepts easily understandable for all children, regardless of age. Option B. Broadcast the program as is, assuming that any educational content is beneficial and that parents are solely responsible for monitoring their children's viewing. Option C. Review the program's complexity to ensure it is developmentally appropriate for the younger children in the broadcast time slot, and consider providing advisories to parents about the sophisticated financial concepts presented. Option D. Air the program during a later time slot when older children are more likely to be watching, without considering the need for advisories. The correct answer is C. Review the program's complexity to ensure it is developmentally appropriate for the younger children in the broadcast time slot, and consider providing advisories to parents about the sophisticated financial concepts presented. Explanation. Performance analysis shows that a local Alabama television station, WZIS TV, has been airing a new children's program that features animated characters discussing complex financial concepts like compound interest and stock market fluctuations. While the program is educational, it is broadcast during a time slot that also includes programming aimed at very young children, and the station has not included any specific advisories regarding the content's suitability for different age groups within the target demographic. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the station's creative freedom and educational aspirations with its legal obligations to protect children and adhere to broadcast regulations in Alabama. The station must exercise careful judgment to ensure its programming serves the public interest, particularly for vulnerable audiences. The best professional practice involves proactively assessing the content's appropriateness for the intended audience and time slot, and implementing clear communication strategies. This includes reviewing the program's complexity and ensuring it aligns with the developmental stages of the children likely to be watching during that broadcast period. Furthermore, the station should consider whether the content necessitates specific advisories to parents or guardians, especially if it delves into topics that might be abstract or require parental guidance for comprehension. Adhering to Alabama's broadcast regulations, which often emphasize the protection of minors and the provision of programming that serves the public interest, requires a diligent approach to content review and audience notification. Broadcasting the program without considering the age appropriateness of its financial content for very young children during that time slot represents a failure to exercise due diligence. Alabama broadcast regulations, while not always specifying exact content for every age group, generally expect licensees to act in the public interest, which includes safeguarding children from potentially confusing or inappropriate material. Failing to provide any advisories or warnings about the sophisticated financial concepts presented, especially when broadcast alongside programming for younger children, could be seen as a disregard for the station's responsibility to its audience. Another unacceptable approach would be to assume that any educational content is inherently beneficial and therefore exempt from careful consideration of its target audience. While educational programming is encouraged, the manner and context of its delivery are crucial. The station has a responsibility to ensure that educational content is presented in a way that is accessible and understandable to the children it is intended for, and not potentially misleading or overwhelming. Finally, relying solely on parental supervision without providing any station-initiated information or warnings is insufficient. While parents play a vital role, broadcasters have a direct responsibility to consider the impact of their programming on children and to provide reasonable guidance when content might be complex or require additional context. Professionals in broadcast media should adopt a proactive and audience-centric decision-making framework. This involves understanding the specific regulatory requirements of their jurisdiction, such as those in Alabama, regarding children's programming and public interest obligations. It necessitates a thorough review of all content, considering its potential impact on different age groups within the target demographic, implementing clear communication strategies, including advisories when necessary, and fostering an environment where content is evaluated for its educational value and developmental appropriateness, are key components of responsible broadcasting. Question: Performance analysis shows that WZI's TV in Alabama is airing a new children's program featuring animated characters discussing complex financial topics like compound interest and stock market fluctuations. The program airs during a time slot that also includes programming for very young children, and the station has not provided any advisories regarding the content's suitability for different age groups within the target demographic. Which of the following approaches best aligns with Alabama broadcast regulations and professional ethical standards for children's programming? Options: A. Review the program's complexity to ensure it is developmentally appropriate for the younger children in the broadcast time slot, and consider providing advisories to parents about the sophisticated financial concepts presented. B. Broadcast the program as is, assuming that any educational content is beneficial, and that parents are solely responsible for monitoring their children's viewing. C. Air the program during a later time slot when older children are more likely to be watching, without considering the need for advisories. D. Focus on the program's educational value and assume that the animated characters will make the complex financial concepts easily understandable for all children, regardless of age. Question 16. The control framework reveals that a local Alabama radio station, WZI's, has been approached by a newly opened gambling establishment within the state seeking to advertise its services. What is the most prudent and legally compliant course of action for WZI's to take regarding these advertising requests? Option A. Thoroughly research Alabama's specific broadcast advertising laws and regulations concerning gambling promotion. Consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama broadcast law and verify the legality of the establishment and its advertised services before agreeing to air any advertisements. Option B. Proceed with airing the advertisements after receiving verbal assurances from the gambling establishment that they are operating legally within Alabama. Option C. Air the advertisements immediately to capitalize on potential revenue, and address any potential regulatory issues only if they arise after the broadcast. Option D. Assume that since the gambling establishment is operating within Alabama, all forms of advertising are permissible under general advertising freedom principles. The correct answer is A. Thoroughly research Alabama's specific broadcast advertising laws and regulations concerning gambling promotions. Consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama broadcast law, and verify the legality of the establishment and its advertised services before agreeing to air any advertisements. Explanation: the control framework reveals a scenario where a local Alabama radio station, WZIS, is considering airing a series of advertisements promoting a new gambling establishment that has recently opened within the state. This situation is professionally challenging because Alabama has specific, and often strict, regulations regarding the advertising of gambling activities on broadcast media. Broadcasters must navigate the complex interplay between commercial interests, public interest, and legal compliance to avoid significant penalties. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any advertising content adheres to Alabama law, which may restrict or prohibit certain types of gambling promotions. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of the Alabama Code and any relevant Alabama Public Service Commission (APSC) guidelines pertaining to broadcast advertising of gambling. This includes verifying the legality of the gambling establishment itself and confirming that the proposed advertisements do not violate any specific prohibitions on content, such as promoting illegal lotteries or certain types of games of chance that are not licensed or permitted by the state. Consulting with legal counsel specializing in Alabama broadcast law before airing any advertisements is a crucial step to ensure full compliance. This proactive measure mitigates risk and demonstrates a commitment to regulatory adherence. An incorrect approach would be to assume that because the gambling establishment is legally operating, all forms of advertising are permissible. This overlooks the nuanced regulations that often govern the promotion of such businesses. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the advertiser's assurance of legality without independent verification. This abdicates the broadcaster's responsibility to ensure compliance with Alabama broadcast laws. Finally, proceeding with airing the advertisements without any legal review based on a general understanding of advertising freedom is a significant regulatory failure. This approach ignores the specific statutory restrictions that Alabama places on broadcast advertising of gambling, potentially leading to fines, license revocation, or other severe sanctions from the Alabama legislature or relevant regulatory bodies. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical broadcasting. This involves 1. Identifying the specific regulatory landscape relevant to the content in question, in this case, Alabama broadcast advertising laws concerning gambling. 2. Conducting thorough due diligence by reviewing applicable statutes and guidelines. 3. Seeking expert legal advice when the regulatory environment is complex or uncertain. 4. Documenting all compliance efforts and decisions. 5. Implementing internal review processes for all advertising content to ensure it meets legal and ethical standards before broadcast. Question 17. The evaluation methodology shows that an Alabama-based television station, licensed by the FCC, is considering expanding its reach by transmitting its programming via satellite to audiences in Canada. What is the most appropriate regulatory compliance strategy for the station to adopt? Option A. Assume that compliance with Alabama state broadcast laws and FCC regulations is sufficient, as these are the primary governing bodies for the station's license. Option B. Conduct thorough research into Canadian broadcast content regulations, including those concerning obscenity, indecency, and advertising, and ensure all transmitted content adheres to these standards, in addition to FCC requirements. Option C. Rely on the satellite provider's technical capabilities to manage any potential cross-border regulatory issues that may arise. Option D. Broadcast content freely and address any complaints or regulatory inquiries from Canadian authorities on a case-by-case basis after transmission has commenced. The correct answer is B. Conduct thorough research into Canadian broadcast content regulations, including those concerning obscenity, indecency, and advertising, and ensure all transmitted content adheres to these standards, in addition to FCC requirements. Explanation: The evaluation methodology shows that navigating international broadcasting regulations presents significant professional challenges due to the complex and often conflicting legal frameworks across different sovereign nations. A broadcaster operating in Alabama and seeking to transmit content internationally must exercise extreme caution to avoid violations that could lead to severe penalties, including license revocation, fines, and reputational damage. The core challenge lies in identifying and adhering to the specific regulations of the target countries, while also complying with Alabama's own broadcast laws and Federal Communications Commission (FCC) rules that govern interstate and international transmissions originating from the United States. The best professional approach involves a proactive and meticulous due diligence process. This entails thoroughly researching and understanding the broadcast content regulations, including those pertaining to obscenity, indecency, political speech, and advertising, in each country where the content is intended to be received. This research must be informed by legal counsel specializing in international media law. The broadcaster should then implement internal compliance protocols to ensure all transmitted content aligns with these identified international standards, as well as applicable U.S. federal regulations. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and risk mitigation by directly addressing the regulatory landscape of the target audience's jurisdiction. An incorrect approach would be to assume that compliance with Alabama and U.S. federal broadcast regulations is sufficient for international transmissions. It fails to acknowledge that other nations have their own distinct legal systems and standards for broadcast content. Such an assumption could lead to the transmission of material that is perfectly legal in the U.S., but is considered illegal or offensive in the target country, resulting in regulatory action by that nation's authorities and potential repercussions for the Alabama-based broadcaster. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to rely solely on the technical capabilities of the transmission equipment to determine reach, without considering the legal implications of that reach. While technology may enable a signal to cross borders, it does not grant permission to do so under foreign law. This approach ignores the fundamental principle of extraterritorial jurisdiction and the responsibility of broadcasters to respect the sovereignty of other nations. Finally, a flawed strategy would be to adopt a wait-and-see attitude, broadcasting content internationally and addressing any regulatory issues that arise after the fact. This reactive stance is highly risky and unprofessional. It demonstrates a disregard for legal obligations and can lead to significant penalties and damage to the broadcaster's reputation. Effective professional decision-making in this context requires a commitment to understanding and complying with all applicable laws before engaging in international broadcasting activities, prioritizing a thorough legal and regulatory review. Question 18. Market research demonstrates a growing concern among residents in Mobile, Alabama, regarding local water quality. A community advocacy group has submitted a draft announcement for broadcast, claiming it is a public service announcement, PSA, aimed at informing the public about potential contaminants and encouraging water conservation. What is the most appropriate course of action for the broadcast station to ensure compliance with Alabama broadcast regulations regarding PSAs? Option A. Immediately schedule the announcement for broadcast, given its stated purpose as a PSA and the urgency of the water quality issue, to ensure timely public information. Option B. Broadcast the announcement as submitted, assuming that any message presented by a community group as a PSA inherently meets all regulatory requirements in Alabama. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the draft announcement to verify its content aligns with the definition of a public service message, addresses a demonstrable community need in Mobile, and adheres to any specific Alabama or FCC guidelines concerning PSA content and attribution. Option D. Focus on the potential for the announcement to generate public discussion and engagement, prioritizing its ability to capture audience attention over a detailed assessment of its specific public service value and regulatory compliance. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of the draft announcement to verify its content aligns with the definition of a public service message, addresses a demonstrable community need in Mobile, and adheres to any specific Alabama or FCC guidelines concerning PSA content and attribution. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because broadcasters in Alabama must balance their public service obligations with the practicalities of content creation and dissemination. Ensuring that public service announcements, PSAs, meet regulatory requirements while also being effective and relevant to the community requires careful consideration of both legal mandates and ethical responsibilities. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying the Alabama Broadcast Regulation Framework to specific content, particularly when dealing with potentially sensitive or controversial topics, without inadvertently violating rules or failing the public trust. The best approach involves a thorough review of the proposed PSA content against the specific requirements outlined in Alabama broadcast regulations concerning public service. This includes verifying that the announcement addresses a community need or issue, is presented in a clear and understandable manner, and adheres to any guidelines regarding sponsorship or attribution that might be stipulated by Alabama law or FCC rules as interpreted by state regulators. Prioritizing accuracy, fairness, and the public interest, while ensuring all legal prerequisites are met, is paramount. This proactive and diligent verification process minimizes the risk of non-compliance and upholds the station's commitment to serving the public. An approach that prioritizes speed of broadcast over thorough regulatory review is professionally unacceptable. While efficiency is important, it cannot come at the expense of legal compliance. Failing to adequately assess whether the PSA addresses a genuine community need or issue, or if its content is misleading or potentially harmful, directly contravenes the spirit and letter of public service broadcasting obligations in Alabama. Such an oversight could lead to regulatory penalties and damage the station's reputation. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to assume that any announcement labeled as a public service automatically satisfies all regulatory requirements without independent verification. Alabama broadcast regulations are specific, and simply labeling a message as a PSA does not exempt it from scrutiny regarding its content, purpose, and adherence to established guidelines. This passive acceptance of a label, rather than an active assessment of compliance, represents a significant regulatory failure. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on the potential for controversy or audience engagement, without a primary consideration of the PSA's public service value and regulatory compliance, is also flawed. While audience reception is a factor in effective communication, the fundamental purpose of a PSA is to inform and benefit the public, as defined by regulatory frameworks. Prioritizing sensationalism or controversy over genuine public service and legal adherence undermines the core mission of public service broadcasting in Alabama. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the specific Alabama broadcast regulations pertaining to PSAs. This involves consulting relevant statutes, FCC rules as applied in Alabama, and any state-specific guidelines. Before airing any PSA, a comprehensive review process should be implemented, including content analysis for accuracy, community relevance, and compliance with sponsorship and attribution rules. If any doubt exists regarding compliance, seeking clarification from legal counsel or regulatory bodies is a prudent step. This systematic and informed approach ensures that public service obligations are met responsibly and effectively. Question 19. Market research demonstrates that a significant portion of the Alabama population identifies with specific cultural heritage groups that are currently underrepresented in mainstream broadcast content. A local Alabama radio station is considering its upcoming programming schedule. Which of the following approaches best aligns with Alabama broadcast regulations concerning localism and diversity? Option A. Develop new programming initiatives specifically designed to reflect the cultural heritage and interests of these underrepresented groups, actively seeking out local talent and perspectives from within these communities. Option B. Continue to focus programming on broadly appealing music genres and talk show topics that have historically generated the highest advertising revenue, as this ensures financial sustainability. Option C. Invest in acquiring syndicated programming from out-of-state providers that feature diverse content, assuming this will satisfy the diversity requirement for the Alabama market. Option D. Allocate a small portion of the broadcast schedule to occasional public service announcements that briefly acknowledge these cultural groups, without altering the core programming format. The correct answer is A. Develop new programming initiatives specifically designed to reflect the cultural heritage and interests of these underrepresented groups, actively seeking out local talent and perspectives from within these communities. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because broadcasters in Alabama have a dual responsibility: to serve the public interest and to operate a profitable business. Balancing the mandate of localism and diversity with the economic realities of broadcasting requires careful consideration of regulatory obligations and community needs. The Alabama Broadcast Regulation (exam) emphasizes these principles, requiring licensees to demonstrate a commitment to serving their local communities. The best approach involves proactively identifying and addressing underserved segments of the Alabama community by developing programming that reflects their unique interests and perspectives. This demonstrates a genuine commitment to diversity and localism, aligning with the spirit and letter of Alabama broadcast regulations. By actively seeking out diverse voices and topics, a station fulfills its public service obligation, enhances its community connection, and potentially attracts a broader audience. This proactive strategy is ethically sound and regulatorily compliant, an approach that prioritizes only commercially viable programming. Neglecting to consider the needs of smaller or less affluent demographic groups within Alabama fails to uphold the principle of localism. This can lead to a lack of representation and a perception that the station is not serving its entire broadcast area. Such a failure to consider diverse community interests can be viewed as a dereliction of the licensee's public interest obligations under Alabama broadcast law. Focusing solely on programming that appeals to the largest possible audience, without regard for the specific cultural or informational needs of minority groups or geographically isolated populations in Alabama, also falls short. While audience size is a factor, it cannot be the sole determinant of programming decisions when the license is granted in the public interest. This approach risks marginalizing certain segments of the community and may not satisfy the diversity requirements inherent in localism. Finally, relying exclusively on existing popular programming formats without exploring opportunities to introduce new or underrepresented content would be a missed opportunity to enhance localism and diversity. Alabama's diverse population requires broadcasters to be innovative and responsive, not merely imitative. This approach fails to actively seek out and incorporate the varied voices and perspectives that constitute a truly local and diverse broadcast service. Professionals should approach programming decisions by first understanding the specific demographics and needs of their Alabama service area. This involves ongoing community outreach and needs assessment. Then, they should evaluate how potential programming aligns with both the public interest obligations of localism and diversity and the station's business objectives. A balanced approach that prioritizes community service while remaining economically viable is the hallmark of responsible broadcasting. Question 20. Market research demonstrates that a media company currently owns one full-power television station in the Birmingham, Alabama Designated Market Area, DMA. The company is proposing to acquire a second full-power television station also located within the Birmingham, Alabama DMA. The U.S. Census Bureau reports the population of the Birmingham, Alabama DMA to be 120,000 households. Under current Federal Communications Commission, FCC, regulations, what is the maximum percentage of the national television households an entity can reach by owning more than one full-power television station in the same market? Option A. The entity can own both stations as long as the combined audience reach does not exceed 35% of the national television households. Option B. The entity can own both stations as long as the combined audience reach does not exceed 75% of the national television households. Option C. An entity cannot own more than one full-power television station in the same market, regardless of national reach percentage. Option D. The entity can own both stations as long as the combined audience reach does not exceed 50% of the national television households. The correct answer is C. An entity cannot own more than one full-power television station in the same market, regardless of national reach percentage. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in broadcast licensing and ownership in Alabama, determining the financial viability and compliance of a proposed station acquisition under specific FCC ownership rules. The professional challenge lies in accurately calculating the aggregate audience reach and ensuring it does not exceed the statutory limit, which requires meticulous attention to detail and a thorough understanding of FCC regulations regarding media ownership. Failure to do so can result in significant penalties, including fines and denial of license transfer. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a precise calculation of the aggregate audience reach of the acquiring entity's existing stations and the target station, ensuring the total does not exceed the FCC's limit for a single market. This approach directly addresses the core regulatory requirement of the FCC's media ownership rules, specifically the prohibition against owning more than one full-power television station in the same market. The calculation must accurately reflect the population of the relevant market as defined by the FCC. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves simply adding the populations of the markets where the existing and target stations are located without considering the FCC's definition of a market or the specific ownership limitations within a single market. This fails to recognize that the FCC's rules are designed to prevent undue concentration of media ownership within a specific geographic and demographic area, not just a cumulative national reach. Another incorrect approach is to rely on a general understanding of media ownership without performing the specific calculation required by the FCC. This overlooks the quantitative nature of the ownership rules and the need for precise data to demonstrate compliance. It assumes a qualitative assessment is sufficient, which is not the case for these specific regulations. A further incorrect approach is to exclude the target station from the calculation because it is a new acquisition. This fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of the ownership rules, which are intended to assess the total media influence of an entity at the time of acquisition or proposed acquisition. The FCC considers all stations owned or proposed to be owned when evaluating compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals faced with such a scenario should first identify the specific FCC regulations governing media ownership in the relevant market. They must then gather accurate population data for the market as defined by the FCC. The next step is to perform the precise calculation of aggregate audience reach, ensuring it adheres to the FCC's limits. If the calculation indicates potential non-compliance, the professional must advise against the acquisition or explore divestiture options to meet regulatory requirements. This systematic, data-driven approach ensures compliance and mitigates legal and financial risks.